Welcome to the Preacher's Studio, a time when we will discuss the art of preaching, working with real sermons and real conversations with preachers. My name is David Schmitt. I hold the Greg H. Bennett Chair of Homiletics and Literature at Concordia Seminary. And with me today is Dr. Rall, who was a former missionary to Papua New Guinea and now is presently a pastor, the senior pastor at St. Timothy Lutheran Church in St. Louis. Thank you for being here, Ron, and welcome.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to sit here and discuss the sermon.
That's good. That's good. I think one of the challenges that we often have in preaching is trying to find a focus, something that we want to focus in on. As I was preparing to listen to the sermon, I read through the text before I came, and there's a lot in there. And so how did you kind of make the decision to go where you went?
Well, first of all, it was a text I'd never preached on before, so I didn't have a background to fall back on or to look at.
Couldn't reach in a barrel and
couldn't reach in the barrel. Yeah, that's always helpful sometimes when you're.
Just even before
I preached on Sunday and then Tuesday, So,
right. Yeah.
But what struck me was not just the things that Jesus did, because chapters 8 and 9 of Matthew were full of miracles that Jesus did, but the reactions to those miracles. How some believed and some just marveled, and some actually just turned against Jesus and said he was using the power of the devil. So it was the reactions that I wanted to kind of focus on and how people react today as well.
Why do you think that's important?
Well, I thought it was particularly important because here preaching in this context, you're preaching to pastoral students,
right,
and people who are in ministry, and they're going to find those kind of reactions. Sometimes I think we think, well, I'll preach the gospel and people are just going to fall at my feet, and they're going to believe, but people are just people everywhere, and some aren't going to believe. Some might be amazed, but that's not faith.
Right.
And so, I think it's kind of important to stress the fact that we, like Jesus, continue to proclaim that message, even though we're not sure just how it's being heard or what the results of it are going to be.
So in a sense, I guess you're seeing yourself as offering an encouraging word to the pastoral ministry students and all Christians, in kind of engaging in a ministry of proclamation in a culture that has radically changed. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's definitely worthy of meditation and conversation, because I think, I agree with you that sometimes our desire is that we preach the word and immediately everything turns out well.
Exactly.
And that often isn't the case. Yeah. And what do you think are some of the other possible reactions to something like that? One would be just shock that it didn't work.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I think particularly in our culture today, people just aren't tuned to that message. So, we live in a world that's maybe indifferent to the gospel. Mm-hmm. And, like I use that one section from the Chronicles of Narnia.
Right. Yeah.
To illustrate the fact that Uncle Andrew, just couldn't believe that he was actually hearing a lion singing.
Right.
And he closed his ears. He hardened his heart. He actually did it intentionally. And I don't know whether it's so much an intentional thing today, but people just seem sometimes indifferent to the message. Mm-hmm. And that's the challenge we have.
Yeah, you kind of drove that point home in that section, if I remember correctly, with a little bit of humor, right? You had some line about the problem is when we, how did it go?
When we make ourselves stupider
than you are, you usually succeed
in doing
right?
that.
Yeah. So you're really trying to help us see that it is not as easy as we would imagine it to be.
Unbelief is a stubborn thing.
Right.
And it's particularly resistant today, I think, in our culture. People, don't necessarily think that there's a truth to be grasped.
Right. And they often see Christianity as a source of oppression and hostility.
Exactly.
Right. Now, and that I think is something that's interesting to me, is that in the sermon, you gave us several examples of kind of the divided responses, and you emphasized kind of negative responses to preaching either in the imaginary realm with Aslan or kind of with the realistic one with McGrath and Dawkins, right? Mm-hmm. But I think one of the dangers for Christians is that we can with hostility, right, as enemies, and they need to be taken down. And yet you avoided that response in the sermon. You still had a compassionate response that they are still people who need to hear, just like
Exactly.
Aslan was singing and singing even though the guy was
Yeah.
resisting. Now, were you aware of that tension?
Well, I wanted to make that plain that, Jesus, he observed the reaction of the Pharisees. And they were pretty hostile to him. Right. To actually blaspheme him and say he's using the power of the demons, to
Right.
cast out demons. But that didn't stop Jesus from preaching and teaching and healing people. He continued his ministry. And there were times in his ministry when he actually got pretty sharp with them. I mean,
Right.
Luke has some examples, woe to you, scribes
Right,
and Pharisees,
right.
Yeah. But for the most part, Jesus was continually open to proclaiming that good news and open to the fact that there might be a response of faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think you did a really nice job of keeping that balance of being honest about the tensions that we're going to face, but then also be encouraging about continuing to do the work that,
Right,
that Jesus did. Yeah.
And I think the Augsburg Article 5 makes that really clear, that we just preach the gospel, trust the Holy Spirit to do the work, and God will work faith when and where He wills. Because faith isn't something we can produce.
Right.
We can only sow that word, we can only proclaim the good news in such a way that it becomes relevant to people, that it engages them,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Holy Spirit can do the work of creating faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and your sermon kind of moved inductively toward that, right? I mean, you didn't start out by telling us, this is a sermon where I'm going to encourage you to keep on preaching regardless of what happens,
Yeah.
because the Spirit's going to work. Instead, you kind of just started out with the divided responses, and then you slowly ended up there. Did you intend to do it that way, or is that how you normally preach?
I don't know if I intentionally did that.
I liked it.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that is the direction that it took. Was not to offer the summary in advance, but to kind of move toward that direction, and particularly, with the audience, the seminary audience, saying, and so we continue to proclaim that good news.
Right.
Even though we know that the responses will be sometimes indifferent and sometimes antagonistic, but we have to trust the power of the Holy Spirit to work faith in the hearts of people.
Right, and I think one value of approaching it that way is that it allowed us as a hearer to actually experience the ministry of Jesus as the foundation for why we continue to do what we do. Because your sermon started like with the first portion was dealing with how people responded, and you dealt with the text and then took us to our present day, and then you kind of came back to Jesus and then took us to the Augsburg Confession and then to our work today. So if you had started out by saying, just continue to preach, that's what the sermon's going to be about, we wouldn't have had that experience of Christ that really pushes us forward, right. Whereas the inductive method did that.
Where the hearer is actually involved in discerning
it,
Yeah.
right, and experiencing it and then having ownership of it in a sense. That was nice. Now, I noticed you used a lot of stories in preaching. And
I do, and I think that's something that I typically do. I like to start the sermon with an illustration, if I can find one. I'm pretty particular about the illustrations that I use, that they really do drive toward the point.
Right.
Sometimes you come across an illustration and say, this would be great, but it doesn't fit.
Right.
And so I
And what's
avoid
the
that.
mistake at that point that a lot of pastors
Well,
make?
I think a lot of pastors put it in, and
I know,
everybody's
it's like,
scratching their head saying, what did he mean by that?
Right, yeah.
So, if it
and then
doesn't...
they say, I guess I'm not following the sermon. No, it didn't belong in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, but I like to do that to start with because I think it engages people right away.
Right.
Stories do that. They have they have a power to do that. And so I guess that's a characteristic of my preaching, to try to engage the people and make sure that first illustration is crucial, because if it doesn't drive toward your ultimate point, then you don't throw it away and just start with the text or something,
Right.
And I do that sometimes, I just can't find the right illustration.
Yeah, yeah. And in the opening story, you did have, what were qualities of the opening story that made it, in your opinion, fit?
Well, the fact that you had, in this particular case, you had a world-class violinist playing in a very difficult piece with one of the most expensive violins in the world, and people could just walk right by without even caring or ignoring it. It didn't touch them. It didn't engage them. And, I think the point of that is that sometimes in our preaching or in our teaching, same thing can happen. People can be distracted.
Right.
This is during rush hour. People want to get home. Okay, he's just a bum playing. They're wanting to get a few quarters, and people toss in a few quarters, but that's, they missed the experience of what was actually happening there.
Yeah, and that image, if I might say, or character of a figure who's world-renowned, playing a very beautiful, difficult piece with a very expensive instrument, that pops up again when you give us the rehearsal of the ministry of Jesus, his teaching and his miracles, and then it pops up again with the Aslan figure, again singing, right? So you have kind of this thread that really holds it all together, that, we've been called to stand in the feet of the apostles and do this work, and yet the world might walk by.
They can.
Attention. So one question that a lot of people ask, I think, and preachers do struggle with, is where do you get the stories?
I mean, there are sites on the internet now, that provide illustrations, and sometimes the search is easier that way, because you can search by Bible texts or by themes or by words or phrases, and sometimes you can find good ones that way. Some are different, harder, but I have some books of illustrations. I don't use those so much anymore because the internet makes it a lot easier to search, faster to search. And I have some 3-ring binders, that are full, but it takes a long time to go through them all to find something. But sometimes, I'll come across an illustration that I know really has some potential for grabbing people's attention, and I'm not going to use it because it doesn't fit that particular text. But I'll remember it, and I can find it again. I'll go back to it, and sometimes you can if you remember a word or a character in the illustration, you can put that in the search thing and find it, and then you can use it,
So kind of it's a habit of living.
It is,
right? Yeah, you're just constantly aware of the things that are happening around you and how they might fit.
Right, and sometimes you can use things from your own experiences too. Those are also very valuable, if you can find something that really fits. And
did you have anything that you left out for this sermon?
For this one? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I probably had pulled out about half a dozen different things that I might use, and just culled some of those out, and said, no, this is it. Well, first of all, I got the message from
the dean of the chapel. They had to be 3 minutes long.
8 minutes. I mean, whoa! I'm going to have to throw these away.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay, because it takes more work, I think, to hone something down to 8 minutes than it does to preach 15 minutes.
Right.
Which is typically what I would preach.
Now, you did spend a little bit of time in the sermon anchoring this small text in the larger flow of Matthew's gospel. Is that something you normally do?
Yeah,
and why?
I think it's just that the context sort of, is important for people to see. That Matthew, the way he structures his gospel, he has this long Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapters.
Yeah.
And then it ends with people, amazed at his authority, that he spoke with authority. And then you have chapters 8 and 9 that are just one miracle after another, bang, 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 as that's all Jesus was doing. But there's a purpose in that, I mean, he goes from the authority of his teaching to the authority and the power that he illustrates in healing people, and still you get the same reaction.
Right. Yeah.
They marvel, they've never seen anything like this before, but then some don't believe, close their hearts and their minds. So the 2 blind men were really interesting, and I first was really intrigued by them, because blind men who are beggars don't usually follow along and beg. They sit by the roadside. They're told to keep their heads down. They don't speak up. Remember when Bartimaeus, is yelling and everybody's saying, "Shut up!" I mean, who are you anyway? You're not supposed to do that. These guys were out of character. They were just not using the proper protocol to follow Jesus into his house. I mean, but I wanted to.
That's another sermon for.
It's another sermon for another time.
Yeah,
Exactly.
And that's sometimes what's frustrating, at least for me, is that sometimes I'll have so many tangents and I'm not sure what I want to preach on yet, and they're all very interesting to me.
That was exactly the way it was
Yeah.
in this case, yeah.
Oh, and then you end up spending a lot of time on something, and you're like, I'm not going to preach this now.
And this was actually a short text, too. It wasn't a long text.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I liked the way, at least for me as a hearer, the way you situated it in Matthew's gospel was very helpful in seeing the marvelous word and the marvelous deeds. I thought that was really, I liked that. And then it gave me, as a listener, a reason why you weren't focusing on the miracles so much here. Because you said, he's been doing miracles, but what I really want to focus on is this little piece. And I thought that was helpful. Sometimes I think as preachers, we can focus on one small piece of the text, and it's good, but we don't let the hearers know that that's what we're doing or why we're doing it.
Yeah.
And
that's, so even if you don't go so much beyond the text, but you just pull out, one part of it, you need to make sure that people understand how does this fit into the context of that whole story, or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
I preached on Sunday on the gospel, John 4, the woman at the well.
Oh, yeah.
And I ended up sort of focusing on Jesus saying, if you knew the gift of God and who it is who is asking you for a drink, you would ask him, and he would give you living water. But there's a lot in that text. You could go with a lot of different tangents, but the people need to understand, you need to kind of connect everything so that people actually understand how it was working.
Right. Yeah.
So you need to kind of tell the story again.
Right.
And
I was going to say, I think the one thing in your sermon was having a series of stories where they're all, in a sense, dealing with the same dynamics, right? You have someone doing something beautiful, amazing, wonderful, and you have two different responses, and then you show us two different responses again, you show us the same thing. It's a way of keeping it coherent and not scattered, going all over the place. And it worked really well. You walk away thinking, there's one big thing that I got here, and there's a reason for it.
Yeah. I just think it's really important if you're going to use illustrations that you can't lead people off on a tangent.
Right.
Because you lose them then. Because stories have that power to pull people's minds, but if it's not going in the same direction you want them to go, you better just cut it out.
Yeah. And how do you manage the story when you're telling it?
Well,
you could build up. You could have built up the opening story a lot larger, right?
Yeah.
Or the Aslan story. So how do you know how much?
Well, I think you have to be sensitive to. I always think don't add things to the illustration, even though they might be there. When you actually get an illustration, you're looking at it.
Right.
There might be a lot of information that's not necessary.
Right.
And there was some of that in that opening story, but cull it out so that only the relevant parts of the story are there. So I think that's generally my approach to that, is just to make sure that you don't add things that aren't necessarily relevant to what you want to do.
Yeah, so you're managing the details for the sake of the meaning, right?
Yeah.
So you do have a sense of why you're telling the story,
Yeah.
and that helps you then
Yeah.
figure out what you're putting in
Exactly.
and taking out.
Yeah.
Good. Well, great. That was a wonderful, enjoyable sermon, and it was a great sitting here talking with you.
Thanks.
I hope you.
Well, it's great to get some feedback too, from
Yeah.
someone that understands preaching, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you very much for listening to another Preacher Studio. May the Lord bless you in your work in the kingdom.